Welcome to the Tournament Poker Edge podcast, brought to you by TournamentPokerEdge.com, the only podcast dedicated exclusively to poker tournament strategy. Now here's your host, Clayton Fletcher.
Hello once again, everybody, and welcome to the Tournament Poker Edge podcast, sponsored by ACR, America's Cardroom, where right now we are in the middle of something called the OSS, the Online Super Series. And this weekend, it's our colossal $2,500 main event with an enormous guarantee. We're expecting a very large field of players from around the world. So get in on the fun by joining ACR using the link in the description. And if you use the promo code TPE, you can receive a first-time deposit bonus of 100% up to $2,000. My name is Clayton Fletcher, and I'm your host. Right back here in New York City. I was in Florida last week. I did play in the Escalator Series at the Hard Rock in beautiful Hollywood, Florida. Not much to talk about there. I busted out early. I played in two different events in between my other obligations and didn't last very long in either one. I did end up playing quite a bit of cash out there, and I love Florida. I love the Hard Rock. I think it's a great room. The player pool is, shall we say, colorful. You definitely get some characters down there, along with the nerdy math geeks that are trying to get everybody's money. It's fun. I really recommend, if you've never been to the Sunshine State, get down there and play some cards with my friends at the Hard Rock Hotel and Casino in Hollywood. I want to start off this episode by talking about the Rio. Yeah, you remember the Rio, right, where we used to do the World Series of Poker? Seems like forever ago, but it really hasn't been that long. For 17 years, the Rio All Suites Hotel and Casino was the home of the World Series of Poker. And many of us developed kind of a love-hate relationship with the property over that time. I mean, you know, the hallways kind of smelled like cigarettes, and the place hadn't been updated since its heyday, which, by the way, guys, most of us are too young, myself included, too young to remember. But in the 80s, when the Rio was built, it was kind of the hot spot in Vegas, where the Voodoo nightclub up on the roof and everything, that used to be a real place to see and be seen. Of course, in recent years, it has declined. It was sold, at least the building itself was sold to a company called DreamWorks, which I do not think is the same DreamWorks that does Steven Spielberg movies. So DreamWorks owns the property, and they recently told a blogger, Scott Rubin of the Vital Vegas blog, which I highly recommend, by the way, if you like to kind of know what's going on behind the scenes in Vegas. Yeah, so Scott has been saying since probably 2018 or so that the Rio will eventually become what is known in the real estate world as a teardown. So apparently there are rumors, and these rumors have been persisting now for about 5 years, that the plan is to move the Oakland A's, who they often have a pretty decent team, but they never get a decent crowd. The stadium in Oakland, where the Oakland Athletics, or the A's, play, is known as the Oakland Coliseum. I think it used to be known as Oakland Alameda County Coliseum, but they shortened it to Oakland Coliseum. It doesn't matter what you call the place, it's almost always empty. Even when the team is doing great, they could have a first place team and they're still attracting about 10,000 players per game, which is not very good. If you think about it, like the Yankees probably get in the 40s, the Dodgers in the 40s. Let's not talk about the attendance at Oriole Park at Camden Yards ever since the Montreal Expos moved to Washington. Is that okay if we don't go there? Anyway, the A's are a long-suffering franchise. They don't have fan support. And you saw what happened when we moved the Oakland Raiders to Las Vegas, where they have enjoyed a lot of popularity as the football team of record in the state of Nevada. And there are thoughts that perhaps the good people of Clark County, as well as those who visit the locale from time to time, myself included, might like to take in a baseball game on a visit to Sin City. Now, who doesn't want to be at a baseball game in the desert heat in August? I'm assuming this place is going to have a retractable roof. Anyway, it would be years until it happens, but the rumors are starting to look more and more likely. MLB Commissioner Rob Manfred recently stated that he would be open to moving a team like the Oakland A's to a place like Las Vegas. So don't think that the Rio will always be there for us to kick around anymore. There's a good chance that if the Oakland A's relocate to Sin City, that it would either happen in that site or perhaps where the Tropicana is now. That's another rumor that's going around. Anyway, not to report on rumors, but just the recent comments by the baseball commissioner kind of giving some credence to this thing that Mr. Rubin has been saying for 5 years. Anyway, that is obviously a not so quickly developing story, but something that might make some of us nostalgic if and when the Rio does eventually cease to exist. All right, let's talk about some of these OSS tournaments. I played in a bunch of them on Sunday, this past Sunday, February 19th. Really great turnouts for all of these tournaments, getting 1,000 or 1,000 to 2,000 players for the $50 to $100 buy-ins that I normally play. So, yeah, good times. I jumped into a $66 PKO. I think the damn thing had a $150,000 guarantee, which is, pretty high. I got off to an unbelievable start in this thing. I mean, I couldn't believe it. Like, I think it was the fourth hand, and I already had doubled up. They start you off with 125,000 chips. I don't know where they come up with that number, but let's just go with it. Let's say 125,000. And yeah, I had 300,000 after like 5 or 10 hands. I doubled up with ace king suited versus queen jack suited, all in pre-flop just for piles. And then I won a few more pots with some pretty decent hands, and things were really going my way. And at the time when there were about 1,200 people already registered into this $66 tournament, your boy was in third place with 350,000. And I already had collected 2 bounties on top of that. Now, at the beginning of this tournament, the bounties start at $15 each. And of course, it's a progressive knockout PKO format. So by the time you get to the final table, a bounty could be $2,000, $3,000, or even $5,000. Obviously, having a big stack in a tournament like that is a great thing for anyone. I mean, it's always nice to have a lot of chips in any tournament. But yeah, when half the battle is doing your best Dog the Bounty Hunter impression, it's always good to have lots of bullets in the gun. So yeah, I was really happy to get off to such a great start. And then the following hand took place. Now lately on the podcast, we've been talking quite a bit about blind versus blind situations. And these used to be very rare in tournament poker. As few as 5 years ago, I think players were raising way too many hands on the button. So the opportunity to play a pot in a blind versus blind situation was pretty rare back then. And none of us really ever learned how to do it because it just didn't come up that often. People knew that stealing the blinds was important in tournament poker back then. And they didn't really have solvers to teach them exactly how often they should be doing so. So many of us, even successful players, were opening pretty close to 100% of the time on the button. Now, to be clear, there are still tables at which I will open basically every single hand, any 2 cards on the button. But that's going to depend on a critical amount of evidence pointing to the assumption that the blinds are too tight and that they don't defend enough. So if I'm at a normal table, I'm not going to be opening anywhere near as often on the button as I would have 5 years ago, as we've all gotten better at poker, thanks in part to programs like PO Solver and GTO Wizard and some of the other programs out there and all the training sites where they're kind of teaching us you're very exploitable if you're raising 100% of the time on the button, because you're just not going to have a good hand often enough in that scenario. So most solvers have us opening about 50% of the time on the button, all things being equal. Now you can obviously deviate from that based on the playing styles of the small blind and the big blind. But yeah, generally, all things being equal, if you don't have reads on your opponent, it's about 50% is right. Okay, so nowadays, I think some players are a little too cautious about what they open on the button, and particularly you see this in online poker during major tournament series. Like if a hand is really, really close, say a hand like Queen 8 suited, which most solvers would have you opening from the button if it's folded to you, a lot of players, I think, just click the fold button because they have 12 or 15 other tables open because they're trying to play every single tournament in the entire OSS. So if you ever get the feeling that one of your opponents is playing a lot of tournaments, that's a tip that I have for you. Sometimes players who have a whole lot of tables open will actually take a little bit of their edge away and replace it with volume instead. So if I can play 12 tables, let's say close to perfectly, but I might be able to still play pretty well at 24 tables. By the way, I'm definitely not talking about myself here. I don't usually play more than 5 or 6 at a time at the most. But there are big time wizards out there, and you know who you are, who can play 20 or 30 tables at once. So yeah, when you're in that kind of league, you really can't afford to take every single edge on every single one of those 30 tables. So I think a lot of times where they'll end up sacrificing a little bit is a situation where it's not a very clear, like, pound the table, fist bump, open, but more like, okay, well, this one's like a 50-50. They might err on the side of folding just so they can give their attention to the other tables that they have open. So if you sense that one of your opponents is playing that way, and he does happen to open from his button when you're in the blinds, you may actually consider playing a tighter style, maybe folding a little more often than GTO might recommend, simply because as his range tightens up, your range should tighten up as well. So that's not what happens in this hand. This is a blind versus blind situation, so it's a full 8-handed table. The blinds are 1,500, 3,000 with a 450 ante per player. And I'm in the big blind with 330,000 when the average is about 145. So we're doing great. I'm in third place. The action folds to the small blind, who's a fairly loose aggressive pro type of player. He runs 22-15. For those who know what those numbers mean, his post-flop aggression factor is 3.0, which means that his ratio of bets and raises to calls is a healthy 3-1. Okay, and I've got about 500 hands on this guy, so I've played with him quite a bit. Now he limps in, just completing the blind, 1,500 more, and I look down at the Queen of Diamonds, Jack of Clubs. So should we check in position or raise? Well, one thing you need to know is that this player, I think, is very likely doing the old I limp in on all my small blinds and then play aggressively with a somewhat polarized range when there is pre-flop aggression following that limp. So, in other words, if he's always going to call from the small blind, he's not just going to lay down and fold every time I raise it up. So maybe this is the kind of hand we should just see a flop with. And that was my thinking here, knowing that my opponent is skillful and that it won't just be super easy to run him over unless he limped in with nothing, in which case Queen High is playing at a pretty strong advantage anyway. So let's just see a flop and try to make the best of it. So I check, and now with 9,600 in the middle, the flop comes Ace of Diamonds, 8 of Hearts, 6 of Clubs. So Ace, 8, 6, Rainbow, and Hero has the Queen of Diamonds, Jack of Clubs. So we've got nothing unless you want to count a couple of pretty nebulous backdoor straight possibilities. I don't really know if that's even worth mentioning at this point. But anyway, the opponent decides to min bet 3K into the 9,600 pot. Now let's talk about ranges here. Now, we said before that he can limp in with virtually all of his hands that he wants to continue. And given that the ante is so high, he should probably be limping, or at least, VPIPing 100% or close to 100% in this situation. He's getting 4.7 to 1 on a call pre-flop, so he may as well just pretty much play just about everything. Now, he can tighten up his range a little bit from there if he feels like there's a strong chance that I'll be raising. And the more aggressive I am pre-flop, the more likely he should be to either tighten that range or expand his 3-betting range. So in other words, he might want to limp occasionally with a junky hand like Queen Deuce offsuit, and sometimes put in the 3-bet with it if I'm the type of player who raises too often in these situations. But you and I both know that I'm not that type of player. I'm not raising with Queen Jack, so how wide is my pre-flop raising range when I'm in the big blind versus a limp from the small? So with all that said, I think that our opponent should actually have more aces than we do. At least my best aces will be in my pre-flop raising range. I mean, when I raise before the flop, I'm usually going to have a strong hand. Ace king, ace queen, ace jack, ace 10, and then mix in some ace 5 suited, ace 3 suited, hands like that. Maybe king queen suited or not, king jack suited or not. You can raise with all of these hands against a small blind who is just limped in. And the only time I wouldn't do so is if I think he's particularly tricky and especially aggressive before the flop. In other words, I hate to bump it up to like 9,000 before the flop and then have him come over the top and I'm just sitting there holding king jack offsuit. What am I supposed to do? It's a little too good to fold, but it's also not the kind of hand that wants to play a big pot. I don't know. Those are the murky waters. And many times when two professional players are in these blind versus blind situations, so many times they do keep the pot small before the flop. Most of these tough pros want to play deeper post-flop. Everybody wants to maximize his post-flop advantage, and so the best way to do that is to play smaller before the flop. This has really resulted in the relative obsolescence of the pre-flop raising wars that we would have seen 15 or 20 years ago, where it was just very much a pre-flop game. Raise, re-raise, 4-bet, all this stuff that we used to see back in the day. I can remember in particular Joseph Chung kind of going absolutely berserk in the World Series of Poker with, I think he had ace 7 offsuit. You just won't see that today because that style of play has taken a back seat to players wanting to be more nuanced and playing more post-flop poker. Now, if I'm in a situation where I think my opponents have an edge over me, if I somehow end up at a really tough table, or maybe I registered for the wrong tournament and now I'm regretting that decision as I'm against a bunch of world beaters, then that's when I will take that higher variance approach and try to play those bigger pots before the flop. So with all that said, this player is more likely to have an ace in his range than I am in mine. Because, again, I would have been raising with a lot of the ace-x combos that I would have in my hand, and he would not necessarily have done the same. He may have limped in planning to 3-bet with a lot of his ace-x combos. So it's a better flop for the small blind in this situation than it is for the big blind. And it makes sense that my opponent would lead for the minimum because there's no reason, whether he has an ace or not, to bet more than that. If he's trying to get called, the best way to get called is to bet small enough for me to call you with second or third pair. And if he's bluffing, 3K should honestly get it done quite often because I have so much garbage in my range for checking back pre-flop. So he min bets for 3K and I decide to go ahead and float. Okay, so I'm going to call with the intention of possibly taking this pot away from him on a later street. You can also just raise it here if you think there's a decent chance he's just, maybe taking a stab. And look, again, guys, he's got a 3.0 PFA, and that tells me that he does take a lot of stabs and that he tends to be on the aggressive side on a lot of flops, which in turn is a reason why I decide to do anything other than fold in this spot. It's because I'm exploiting this player's tendency to be a little too aggressive. I don't think I mentioned this before, but my opponent starts this hand with 112,000 in chips, so we're doing fine. No one's really pot committed or anything like that yet. We've got plenty of chips in our stacks, and I make the call. And now with 15,600 in the middle, the turn comes the 4 of clubs for a board of ace of diamonds, 8 of hearts, 6 of clubs, 4 of clubs. Hero holding the queen of diamonds, jack of clubs, and the opponent now checks. So what to do in this spot? We did float the flop. Is this a good card for us to try to use as an opportunity to take the pot away? Well, the 7-5 got there, and 2 clubs now came in. I'm not too worried about my opponent having picked up a flush draw with this card, because I think he probably, number one, would have betted again, and also a lot of his flush draws will have a jack of clubs in them, so my holding the club makes it just that much less likely that he's got a club draw himself. And the fact that he's checked again, and the fact that he tends to be so aggressive, I just decided, that's how we got here in the first place. I wanted to see what happened on the turn. This card is pretty much a blank. I mean, it does complete one straight, but otherwise it's a blank. So I decided to go ahead and take a stab at this one. I put in 9K into the 15,600 pot with the intention of probably shutting down if I get any type of action at all on this bet. This is going to be a one and done for me. I put in 9K, and to my delight, my opponent folds. Now, I included this hand in our discussion because, number one, this is how you play a deep stack. You can take these kind of chances. It didn't really hurt me much to call that 3,000 on the flop and see what happens on the turn. This player gets away with a lot of shenanigans, as evidenced by the fact that he's got that 3-to-1 ratio over 500 plus hands. There's just no way, guys. There's no way your number is going to be that high without your taking at least a few liberties. So this felt like it might have been a liberty to me. I decided to make the call and then take it away on the turn. That's a pot that many of us would lose. You know, you miss the flop, you don't really have much going on, and you just give up. And many times that is the correct play, but I like to look for opportunities to put GTO aside and make my move. And I did it here, and it worked out, and then I built a much bigger chip stack, which I kept for a little while, and then all hell broke loose. A lot went bad. I lost a medium-sized all-in with the ace-jack of hearts versus the 9-8 of hearts. And the 9-8 of hearts flopped a straight, all in pre. I lost with ace-jack on jack-jack 4 to a running straight. And, you know, not to tell you guys bad beat stories, but just in a short period of time, I went from one of the chip leaders down to just being a little bit above average. About an hour and a half later, when the average stack was 185, we had 211. So just above the average stack there, when the blinds were 3,500 and 7,000 with a 900 ante per player. And we're at a whole different table now. The action folds to the hijack, who is what we call a tag, a tight aggressive player. I have only 30 hands on him, but what I have observed so far is that he is not aggressive either before the flop or on the flop. So it's only 32 hands, and his numbers are 17-7 with a PFA of 1. Quite a different opponent from the one we were just discussing. But once again, I have ace-jack. So we just talked about how ace-jack has been wrecking me in this tournament, and it's funny how our brains try to see patterns where there really aren't any. You know, we're not really meant to understand random occurrences as a random deck of cards is. Anyway, the tag has about 345,000 in his stack, so he's got us well covered. He's been doing quite well playing his tight, aggressive style, and he's in the hijack. He makes it 14,700, so just a smidge over the minimum raise, and I am in the small blind with, once again, the ace of hearts, jack of hearts. So, given this player's HUD stats, I actually don't even hate folding here. We've got an ace jack, which is going to be a hard hand to play from out of position unless we flop a flush or a flush draw, which we usually won't, right? We've also got another player yet to act in the big blind, and even if that player does go away, we'll be out of position. And even if we flop really well, it's going to be hard to get a lot of chips out of a player who is tight. I mean, I know I called him a tag a minute ago, but really 17-7 with a 1 PFA is more like a tap, tight and passive type. And like I said, it has been working out quite well for him. He's got plenty of chips, and so he might have a philosophy of it's working, so why change anything? So perhaps I should just fold. I don't know. I'm kind of a sucker for a suited ace-jack. I think I would fold ace-jack offsuit, but this hand's just a little bit too good. It's probably one of the worst hands that I'll have when I call a raise from the hijack from this opponent when I'm in the small blind. So yeah, I just call. You can also 3-bet, by the way, but there again, you're going to have all the same types of problems. Like if you get action from the original raiser, you're going to be out of position, and he's unlikely to give you a lot of action unless you're beat. So for that reason, maybe I should just throw it away, but I'm suited, so I call, and the big blind folds, so we're going to be heads up, out of position, hero holding the ace of hearts, jack of hearts, and with 44,400 in the middle, hero with 197,000 in the stack for an SPR of right around 4.5. The flop comes ace of clubs, queen of spades, deuce of spades. So ace, queen, deuce with 2 spades, and we have the ace, jack of hearts for top pair with a backdoor straight draw. I check, and my opponent puts 98.20 into the 44,400 pot. I'm not really into folding for that price. Not with top pair. Even if your PFA is really low, I only have 30 hands on you. I'm not convinced just yet. I have to call. I could also check raise, but I'm not crazy about that move because you end up kind of turning your hand into 7 deuce a lot. When you check raise, you really only get called when you're beat, or at least when your opponent has a strong flush draw. Yeah, I'd rather not get into that kind of situation here. No reason that I can see to turn top pair into a bluff, at least not yet. All right, so I call, and now there's 64,000 in the middle, and we have 187,000 remaining in our effective stack. And the turn comes the 8 of hearts. So our board is now ace of clubs, queen of spades, deuce of spades, 8 of hearts, and we've got the ace, jack of hearts. I decide to check again, and this time my opponent bets 23K into 64K. I'm pretty happy to just call this bet. I don't really know what he's up to. Is he just milking me? Did he flop a set? Does he have ace queen for top 2 pair? Even if he did have that hand, wouldn't he be betting a little bit bigger because tight players tend to fear the worst and worry about getting outdrawn? Not really sure what to make of this one, and I call. The pot is now 108,000. We have 164,000 left in our stack, and the river comes the 7 of clubs for a final board of ace, queen, deuce, 8, 7 with 2 spades and 2 clubs, and no draw came in. So what to do? I mean, it doesn't really make sense to lead right now. I mean, I guess I would lead sometimes if I missed my flush or whatever. The way I've been playing this hand, it does kind of look like I might have a draw. I would play a lot of draws this way, to be honest. But I don't know. I don't think that leading makes a ton of sense. I decided to just check and see what happens. I was willing to call another small bet on the river, but kind of hoping that our opponent checks back with a hand like ace-10 and that we can just win a nice big pot having him out-kicked. Instead, our opponent shoves effectively 164,000 into the 108,000 pot, so about 150% of the pot has been wagered, and now my hand has shriveled all the way up into just a pure bluff catcher. I have 1 pair with a jack kicker and a lot of confidence that my opponent is not value betting worse. Against a loose aggressive opponent where so many draws missed, I think you can make a really good case for calling, and you should call at least once in a while in a heroic way. But again, this guy is 17-7. It's only 30 hands, but if you sit down at a regular live poker table and play 30 hands with somebody, after 30 hands, that's almost an hour's worth. You're going to have a pretty strong sense of how that player operates. Now, online, 30 hands go by much faster, maybe 20 or 25 minutes on ACR. So it's a lot harder to really gauge what these numbers mean. On top of everything else, guys, I have a $30 bounty on my head, which our opponent may or may not be trying to collect. You will see more all-in overbets on rivers in PKOs than you do in other tournaments, because such a big part of making money in these things is collecting as many bounties as possible. It's obviously not necessary to do that when you're bluffing, because you're not going to win the bounty if your opponent doesn't call. For that reason, some players are more likely to be value betting when they overbet rivers in PKOs than bluffing, because sizing up your bluffs in the same way as your value bets is just not similarly incentivized. So I don't know. I sat there for a while. I timed it down for a bit and eventually threw my hand away. I hate to have a bluff catcher and have to fold it and not catch a bluff with it, but I think I made the right decision in this spot and continued my streak of losing pots with ace-jack, suited or not. So let me know what you guys think about this one and the other one. I thought these were two pretty interesting spots from that $66 OSS tournament. I ended up winning a few $100s in this thing. I got like 85th place or something like that. Speaking of interesting tournaments, you guys, we've got another free roll this coming Sunday on ACR. It's the TPE free roll. Get in the Discord. We're going to give instructions in the Discord on how you can enter the $1,000 free roll this Sunday, February 26, 2023 at 5 p.m. Eastern, New York City time. There's a link in the description of this podcast, what we used to call the show notes. Check the show notes, guys, and join the TPE Discord. Make sure you're subscribed to this podcast. Sometimes we like to leave the password in a special little non-episode episode so that those of you who are actual podcast listeners have first crack at getting into the TPE free roll, which is designed to reward our valued and beloved members. Please get at me on Twitter, guys, at Clayton Comic. Rate and review the podcast. And for everyone here at Tournament Poker Edge, with special thanks to our very generous sponsor, Americas Cardroom, I'm Clayton Fletcher. Thank you so much for listening.
I wanna hold them like they do in Texas plays. Fold them, let them hit me, raise it, baby, stay with me. Luck and intuition, play the cards with babes to start. And after she's been hooked, I'll play the one that's on her heart. Oh, whoa, 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 whoa. I'll get her heart, show her what I got. Oh, whoa, 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 whoa. I'll get her heart, show her what I got. Can't read mine, no she can't read a mile. Poker face, she's got to love nobody. Can't read mine, no she can't read a mile. Poker face, she's got to love nobody. Poker face, poker face. Poker face, poker face. I wanna roll with her, a hard pair we will be. While little gambling is fun when you're with me. I love it. Russian roulette is not the same without a gun. And baby, when it's love, if it's not rough, it isn't fun. Oh, whoa.